Hi everyone, this is Travels with an Archaeologist. I'm the archaeologist, now let's get into the travels.
So, as an archaeologist, I'm no stranger to controversy, especially on YouTube where I put up, wait for it, real facts. I also don't shy away from discussing the controversial because it's important for us in the industry to discuss these things. A big part of archaeology is public engagement, and we need to discuss the facts, and we can't shy away from the controversial. With that being said, today's topic is the Parthenon Marbles. So the Parthenon Marbles are these sculptures taken from the top of the Parthenon in Athens. In 1805, Lord Elgin paid the Ottomans, who controlled Greece at the time, to take the marbles for himself. They were then transferred into his private collection in Britain and eventually were donated to the British Museum, and the museum retains them in their own private collection. Now, Greece demands them back, saying that the Ottomans were an occupying empire and that they had no right to sell them to the British in the first place. This is one of, if not the most famous controversy in archaeology. But before I get into that, and yes, I will get into that, I want to focus on the Parthenon marbles themselves, what they say, and what makes them so archaeologically significant and so significant to the Greeks. So first off, when were they made? Well, the Parthenon of Athens is so well known that we really don't need to get into a great amount of detail about it. It's pretty much synonymous with the city of Athens, and indeed with Greece itself. The Athenians began building it in 447 BCE following the destruction of the former temple by the Persians a few decades earlier in the Greco-Persian Wars. It was completed in 432 BCE. The whole thing was designed by Phidias under the auspices of Pericles, who are, if you know nothing about classical history, two very big names from that time period. Athens under Pericles was the Athens that we tend to think of when we think of ancient Athens and ancient Greece in general. It was the highest power in Greece, and it was undergoing a renaissance of literature, art, and philosophy during this period. It was the age of Socrates and Athenian democracy, an era that is still inspiring and shaping the society of Europe. And the Parthenon, as the city's main temple to Athena, had to look every inch like the temple worthy of a city that Athens wanted to be. And indeed, the Parthenon at the time was the most richly decorated temple in all of Greece. The marbles portrayed the triumphs of Greek culture over barbarian outsiders, a symbol of their victory over Persia. Over the main entrance on the eastern side was the victory of the gods over the Titans, with the Greeks fighting the Amazons on the west. The fall of Troy and the Greeks fighting the Centaurs round out the north and south sides, respectively. The eastern pediment, meanwhile, contains a depiction of the birth of Athena, and the western pediment depicts her competition with Poseidon for being the patron deity of Athens. And these were originally brightly colored, and were sculpted in such a way that looking up at them from down below would give you the best view, almost bringing the sculptures to life. Indeed, despite the fact we tend to think of classical art as being of white marble, the Greeks loved color. The paint wore off over the centuries, but what really damaged them was that the British scholars who originally examined them had these reliefs cleaned extensively, removing all traces of paint. The heads, however, were broken off by Christians in the 5th century in an effort to remove pagan symbols. But you can see that these are obviously a cornerstone of Greek and Athenian history and culture. Some of these marbles do remain in Greece, and others were lost through, shall we call it, the trials of time and history. But the bulk of them were removed by Lord Elgin and taken to London under permission of the governing body of the time, that body being the Ottoman Sultan. The Sultan was, obviously, not a Greek, and this is where the controversy comes in. Greece has made it a top priority to get these symbols of their heritage back, despite the fact the museum maintains it has purchased these sculptures legally. And it has caused diplomatic rows even in this past year. So, what's going on? Why does Britain insist on keeping these marbles? Now, believe it or not, there is a case for not returning every stolen item, assuming you believe that the marbles were stolen in the first place, and I'm not even here to say that everything should be returned. So, what are the reasons not to return an item? Well, if there is a very good chance that it will be destroyed, looted, or sold onto the black market if it is returned, we arguably do more harm than good by returning them. For example, when ISIS destroyed Nimrud, it was actually fortunate that the British Museum had artifacts and notes from their own collection, meaning that not everything was destroyed by terrorists. The Taliban also have a documented history of archaeological vandalism, meaning anyone returning artifact to Afghanistan would be pretty irresponsible. So, does this hold water with Greece? Well, I mean, it could. The British Museum has this nice climate-controlled room for the marbles. Greece would just leave them outside. I mean, how could they possibly look after them? They're practically the same environment. Look at these pictures side by side. There's no discernible difference. How would Greece possibly keep them warm and dry outside better than the UK could inside? After all, they only lasted 2,000 years in the medium they were designed for. This is nothing to a room that simulates a warm, dry environment that Greece's outdoors simply cannot match. It's also not like Greece has anywhere indoors that it would display them either, and let's be honest, it'd be pretty poorly lit. The second reason the museum can't give the marbles back is because they wouldn't be looked after. And this isn't a patronizing argument at all. This is because the Greeks are stupid. The Parthenon marbles were originally painted with absolutely no respect for them. They needed to be acid washed. It really was for the art's own good. Acid washing artifacts will always preserve them better than leaving them alone in an environment that has already preserved them this long. A third reason is that they're more accessible to the general public where they are. Again, this is a valid argument. After all, if you're not British, do you really count as a person? They have far more of a genetic and cultural link to ancient Greece than the Greeks. I mean, just look at how similar these two cultures are. Practically indistinguishable. And everyone knows how cheap London is to get into and get around in, and that Greece has no facilities or museums at all. Besides, we're all Europeans anyway. It's not like Britain ever had a resounding dismissal of their European identity. And Greece really is inaccessible. There is no way for the average person to get to Greece if they really want to experience Greek culture. And how can we forget about just how chaotic Greece is? Britain is a good, stable caretaker, and nothing is going on that might call that into question. Yes, I actually said that with a straight face, and yeah, it was pretty difficult. A fourth reason is that if the artifacts were obtained legally, a country isn't just allowed to change its mind someday in the future. There was no Greek authority at this time, and the only government Lord Elgin could have bought the marbles from was the Ottoman Empire, and they did give him permission. Now, putting aside my previous sarcasm, this is probably the most valid argument that the British Museum has. As much as the Greeks don't like it, they simply did not exist as a nation-state in 1805. There was no Greek government to go to. But even back then, there was kind of an acknowledgement that this might not be as entirely legal as it sounds, as Britain had a special parliamentary inquiry into the legality of the marbles in 1816, 5 years before the Greek War of Independence began. Now, given that the marbles were an instant success in Britain, you could argue that Parliament had a strong motivation to find their acquisition legal, but that wouldn't happen. There is no partisanship or self-interest in British politics. And when Greece did gain independence, one of the first things they did was to ask the British Museum to return the marbles in 1835. Conveniently, the British Museum's website says that the Greeks didn't ask for the marbles back until 1983, making it look like they waited 150 years before making the request. Actually, this is just when they stopped asking the museum directly and tried to go over their heads to the British Parliament. At any rate, this legal grey area is the best argument the museum has to stand on. Unfortunately, this argument is undermined by the museum itself. If the British Museum were more open to returning other controversial objects that were objectively stolen or looted, like the Benin bronzes, say, or Egyptian mummies, perhaps they'd have more of a leg to stand on with artifacts that were obtained with at least an appearance of legality. And for their part, the British Museum acknowledges this problem by simply ignoring it in official statements. Heading into their room for the Parthenon marbles, it says nothing of how they were attained. Even the dedication on the wall ignores the difficult history of how they got there. And at the end of the day, even if the Greeks were under an Ottoman government, it was obvious, even to people at the time, that they were not Ottomans themselves. Unlike many other parts of the Ottoman Empire, the Greeks remained a people apart, like the Slavs and the Arabs. They did not speak Turkish, most of them were still following the Greek Orthodox religion rather than Islam, and they were acknowledged as a separate people even by the Ottomans themselves. Although their status differed in the empire based on the era, it was obvious that the Greeks were not the same people as the Turks, and the fact that they were without a government was very much an Ottoman ploy to force unity and stifle dissent, and not a mark of how the land actually was. And it's not like this is a common issue worldwide either. Contrary to popular belief, most museums these days are not filled with stolen treasures, at least not anymore. Don't get me wrong, some still are. The British Museum is not alone in this club of museums that retain stolen artifacts, but most of them are actually doing things by the book these days. Foreign objects in most museums these days are there with permission of their modern governments of origin, and many have been returned upon request. This hasn't been a universal truth, but museums have, at least by and large, come to terms with the need to reconcile their collections with a modern conscience. By refusing to do either of these things, the British Museum undermines its own argument. And I think there are many at the museum who know this. The British Museum is increasingly being forced to come to terms with this, and for their part has even attempted a reconciliation with Greek authorities, offering many of the sculptures to go back as a loan. But understandably, the Greeks no more want to borrow their sculptures from London any more than you want to borrow your own car from a carjacker. Lastly, the implicit argument, which is never said out loud, is that by returning the marbles, it sets a precedent for returning everything else. And to that I say, so? Is there something wrong with that? And then you go back to, well, archaeologists, didn't you just say that Iraq and Afghanistan would be irresponsible to send the artifacts back? Yeah, I did. And there is a part of that believes that, but at the same time, it is difficult to reconcile with how these artifacts were retained. One stolen artifact in the past does not give you the right to hang on to it now. Maybe some of these arguments do hold weight. We really would be consigning Assyrian and Mesopotamian artifacts to oblivion if we returned them to modern-day Syria or Iraq. Or maybe you think that even if we do, we should still give them back because their fate should be in the hands of their descendants for better or for worse. After all, who are we to say you can have your culture back when you learn to play nicely with it? Especially since the reason so many of these regions are unstable is due to Western intervention. And I'm not going to say that's wrong because it's not. But you're also not wrong to want to keep artifacts from being destroyed. It's also valid to say, I'll keep this safe for you while you work out your issues because it's valuable for everyone, not just you, to see them survive. But the fact is, Greece is not in any situation that justifies this attitude. Even with past economic troubles, they've remained a stable democracy that's more than capable of looking after their own past. And by applying this blanket logic that Britain is just better for all the artifacts is patronizing and imperialist, and it shuts down even legitimate concerns over those countries and autocracies who would see humanity's cultural heritage destroyed to promote their own narrative. So I think it's pretty obvious where I stand on this issue, especially with the Parthenon Marbles, or at least it should be by now. But the Parthenon Marbles aren't really the complicated part of this question. I kind of chose a softball, to be perfectly honest. There is a legitimate discussion to be had over the artifacts from Iraq, Syria, Afghanistan, and arguably even Egypt or areas that could fall back into instability or can't afford the systems to preserve these delicate artifacts. But Greece is not in this category. Far from it. But I do want to know what you think. Is there ever a case for keeping artifacts? Or should they all be given back regardless, even if it does mean they're destroyed? And what gives anyone the right to make that judgment? Feel free to leave a comment on the subject below. All I'm going to ask is that you be respectful. But that's all I have for today. Thanks for making it to the end of the video. Please remember to like it and subscribe to the channel. As soon as I hit 500, I start making money off of those ads YouTube forces you to sit through. So until next time, I'm the Archaeologist, and this has been The Travels.